So we are about ready to begin. First, I wanted to apologize to any alumni that were confused about where to go tonight. I know there was a mishap going to Frank Dining Hall, so apologies in advance if that was your case. For tonight, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Pomona Student Union to Media Empires. My name is Daniel Martin, and I will be moderating tonight's event. The Pomona Student Union, as Josh was talking about earlier, is a student-run, nonpartisan organization dedicated to increasing the level of open and honest dialogue on campus. By hosting debates, panels, and discussions, we seek to present multiple perspectives so that we may challenge the assumptions of students, community members, and ourselves. For more information about the Pomona Student Union and upcoming events, please visit our website at psu.pomona.edu. Now, tonight, we are here to discuss how media conglomerates affect journalism, politics, and society. To begin with, in the United States, an active and informed populace is considered essential for an effective democracy. From civics classes in high school to campaigns preaching the importance of voting, we're repeatedly told that we are responsible for upholding our country's integrity, and this can only be done by actively staying informed. Yet, the current state of media is up for debate. Many state that over the past few decades, there has been a consolidation of media ownership, and that this has compromised the quality of journalism, and thus our ability to remain informed. Others disagree, arguing that such assertions are simplistic, and that changes to media have allowed for improvements in our access to education and information. How has media changed? Where is media going? And what do these changes mean for democracy? Tonight, we have brought Benjamin Compaine and Peter Hart to discuss and debate these issues. Ben Compaine is the author, co-editor, or co-author of 12 books, including Who Owns the Media? He is also the co-editor Emeritus of the Journal of Media Economics and is a professor of media management at Fordham University. Peter Hart is the active director for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, a writer for Fair's magazine Extra, and a co-host and producer of the syndicated radio show Counterspin. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers. The format of tonight's debate will be question and response. I will read a question, each speaker will have 4 minutes to respond, and then we will have an additional 2 minutes for each speaker to respond, to rebut each other. So without further ado, let's begin with tonight's first question. A successful democracy, as stated earlier, depends on a well-informed populace. So in an ideal democracy, what role would media play? We'll begin with Mr. Compaine.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of liberal arts colleges. More people want to be coming to them instead of big universities because I went to a small
Can you speak up, please?
Hello? Any better?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, I'm a graduate of a small liberal arts college where I still remember the impact of learning how to learn and to think critically. So it's really a pleasure to be part of this event at the school. At this college, I was a political science major, where I studied Rousseau, Montague, Hobbes, Locke, Burke, all of whom were instrumental in creating this notion of democracy. So actually, my first thought is, what's an ideal democracy? Because each of these philosophers, and many since then, have their own version of what might be an ideal democracy. So I'm not sure what that would be. If I had it, someone else might have a different ideal democracy. I think we have to deal with the democracy we have. It's imperfect, it can be improved, but we have something that has evolved quite nicely. So the question really is, what's the role within this democracy? One of the people I studied in college was an author named Robert Lane, political scientist from Yale, who wrote a book called Political Ideology. He talked about a permissive consensus that exists in this country. And to take a whole book and condense it, what he essentially said was that there is a pretty wide middle range of political ideology that we accept. That we don't always agree on it, but as long as you're within 2 standard deviations or so of the middle, we're okay if it moves a little this way, that way, and we can disagree, but that's all okay. Then there details, the two standard deviations. My sense is that the media has worked very well for the mainstream, for the two standard deviations of the media. The media, traditionally, up to now, has probably not worked real well for the fringes. I say until now because I think with the internet, which is I think this, the elephant in the room here, is many things that have changed, and the notion of the discussion that I started when I wrote Who Owns the Media back in 1979 and redid in 2000 is very different today. The First Amendment is so amazing. If you're a student of history and you know that the press back in the era of the Founding Fathers was savage. They were very opinionated. Every newspaper had its own point of view. There was no sense of objectivity, of neutralism. That wasn't what the press was. Thomas Jefferson was savaged by the press at the time. And yet here's this guy who said, most of it, we're left for me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government. I would not hesitate to prefer the latter. And this is a guy who was attacked constantly. James Madison, we probably heard less from than that. He says a popular government without popular information or means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. So clearly, and perhaps the only thing we will agree on, I don't know, this evening, is that clearly the information is important to a democracy. We look at China as a thriving sort of capitalist system that's working, but their attitudes to the press is very different, and I think that's going to be a long-term problem because they don't have that information and they can't have democracy. I do want to point out, though, that even though we're talking about media and democracy, probably even the bigger role of media today, maybe not more important, but the bigger role is it's in culture. And most of what we see in the media has to do with our culture and entertainment. And I think the discussion today is going to be more on the implications for democracy. Let's not forget the media is a much larger role.
Mr. Hart?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back. I can't remember the last time I was here. It was a couple of years ago in a different building entirely. But things look shipshape. Throughout the history of the country, we have had these discussions about what the role of journalism is in our democracy. And again, back to the founders, there has been this appreciation for what journalism should do in a democracy and the role it should play. And government policies have helped shape the kind of media system we think we should have or we will end up having. From the colonial press to those partisan papers that savaged Thomas Jefferson, to papers that appeal to a racial or ethnic minority group, all the way up to TV licensing, radio licensing, the debate over network neutrality. The government's role has been key in sort of refereeing this discussion about what kind of system we want to have. The thing about our notions of freedom of speech and the First Amendment, we agree that our First Amendment rights make us a unique country, and I think that's true. The thing that we don't appreciate, or I think is underappreciated, is that that extends to the rights not just of people who publish newspapers, but the rights of every citizen to access a range of diverse sources of information. That's part of First Amendment law and our understanding of how the First Amendment should be interpreted. I think the healthiest way to think about the media, again, we can't figure out what a healthy democracy is going to look like, but a healthy media system, we can think of it conceptually as that public space where we have these important discussions about what matters to our country and what matters in the world. So we have very high expectations for our media system, and we should. We should have very high expectations about what journalism should do in this kind of scenario. Journalism should be critical, skeptical, and essential. It should examine government power. We should feel disappointed and sometimes outraged when it fails to do that. You should be outraged about journalism's failure in the run-up to the Iraq War. You should be outraged that a housing bubble was inflated and burst without much critical scrutiny from the press. The important thing to think about, then, is because we have these expectations, is that the media is not just another product. It's not a widget factory. We have different expectations. Journalism should do something different. Not just tell us what we think we need, but tell us the things that we do, in fact, need to know. We'll argue over what those things are, but that's the role of journalism, ideally. Now, those kind of high-minded values conflict oftentimes with the values of a giant multinational corporation that owns a lot of television stations or radio stations. They're the dominant players in our media system. They are profit-seeking, advertiser-supported. The system works well for them as owners. It works well for shareholders. It doesn't always work well for consumers, i.e. citizens. I always think of a study that was done at USC, the Lear Center, a couple of years ago. They looked at local television in Los Angeles, local TV news. Now, I grew up here, so I know that it's terrible. But they had to quantify just how bad it is. So they watched the newscasts, 20 seconds of a newscast on any given night, the 20-something minutes of a half-hour newscast. 20 seconds was about local government. 3 minutes was about crime. 3.5 minutes was about sports and weather. I grew up here, so I know that there's not much to talk about with the weather, so it was probably mostly sports. You see something like that, no matter how you define journalism's role, you know that that is a failure. And it doesn't come from nowhere. It flows from the system that creates that kind of journalism. Very good for advertisers, very profitable, or for our democracy. We have debated for years what kind of media system we want to have after the New Deal and before, and we'll be debating this forever. But I think it's important to think about it from different angles. I saw some research a couple of years ago from non-readers of a daily newspaper. And I said, why don't you read the paper? Well, I don't see people like me in the paper. I look at the advertisements, the special sections, real estate, living, how to decorate your expensive loft. And I feel like that doesn't speak to me or for me or about me. And those are people who essentially aren't invited to the public square. So our challenge when we're thinking about a better media system, and we'll always be thinking about a better media system, is how to create one that has room for everyone.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah. The problem with this argument is that the First Amendment says government shall make no law affecting freedom of speech and press. Now, we know that that doesn't perfectly apply when it comes to broadcasting because of spectrum rights. But for the media generally, the government can't tell us what, the media, what to say, what not to say. What I think the argument I'm just hearing is that so long as the media is controlled by private corporations for the most part, that we're never going to have more of what some folks would like to see on the evening news, and I don't know what that is. I suspect the evening news, some people should look more like C-SPAN. And I don't know how many of you probably more watch C-SPAN in this audience than sort of the general population. But the fact is, whenever the media, especially television, has tried to sort of be more serious, it has not gotten people to tune in. And if you don't tune in, it doesn't make much sense. For years, PBS has some excellent programming, and at its peak, when CBS, NBC, and ABC were the only three networks, and would each get roughly 30% of the audience, PBS would get 2% of the audience. And that's when anyone could tune into it anytime and see better stuff, depending on what we mean by better. So I don't think it's a matter of who owns it. It's a matter of what people, using their own free will, decide to buy, decide to listen to, and decide to watch.
The First Amendment argument, and this is rooted in several Supreme Court decisions, including the Red Line decision, is about the rights, not of broadcasters, but of the public to access information. And the media companies have gone to the Supreme Court and other courts over the years to try to shake off what little regulation there is of their public interest obligations. And the courts have always ruled that the rights of the listeners, the rights of the viewers are paramount. So it is part of the discussion that we need to have about what kind of media system we want. As for a media outlet that might be more popular, the Car Crash and Sports Network would be enormously popular. The question we have to ask ourselves is that the kind of media system we think is good in a democracy? Sure, a lot of people would watch it, but would they know more about the world having watched that? Free choice is obviously going to drive people to watch or consume certain types of media. The question is whether it serves our democracy. Remember, the only reason anyone has a television station is because the government gave them permission to broadcast on it. That's the only reason anyone has a radio station. The government decided to give licenses to these people. The government decided to let radio companies get bigger and bigger after 1995. This was the government's decision, and we live with the consequences. No one thinks radio is better now under a smaller number of owners than it was 20 years ago. Maybe one person might think so. But I think the sense is that the format and the voice has been lost. And it's purely understandable from a business standpoint. It's a lot cheaper to put on certain kinds of programming. So the question isn't what works for owners and what's profitable and what people might watch. It's what's on and what are we learning and what are we not learning.
Thank you. Our next question. Many critics are quick to point out an increase in the consolidation of media outlets. Is this a fair critique? How has media changed with special respect to ownership and conglomerates? Begin with Mr. Hart.
I think it's a fair observation. The question is, what does it mean, and does it matter that some companies are bigger now than they were before? So that's the more important point. From our perspective as critics of a consolidated media, we want to ask ourselves, is it fair to attribute certain trends, certain events to ownership? And I think if you're studying anything, as college students or anyone else, you do look at the structure of what it is that you're studying, who owns it, who benefits from it, who profits from it. And that's, I think, understandable if you're looking at media. I think media performance is important. You trace that back up the river to who owns it and why, what motivates them. We have, in the last 30 years, seen this intense period of concentration. Certain companies have become enormously bigger and more powerful than they were 30, 40 years ago. A handful of companies have tremendous power now. You can get into arguments about how you measure that kind of power, but I think it's hard to dismiss the idea out of hand that media conglomerates have more power now than they did only a short time ago. We're talking mostly old media. I think is the term that people like to use now: radio, television, newspapers. Though you can think of cable televisions and your monopoly in most places. Same with internet access. You have a choice of 2 or 3 providers. Radio, we've seen this dramatic consolidation in that industry as well. I think the criticism has been on the loss of local content. The areas are more homogenous than they were before this. And the important thing to come back to is that this is not the natural order of things. This is not capitalism sorting things out via competition. It's government policy to encourage or allow certain changes in media ownership and law. Example A, I think, for Exhibit A, would probably be the Los Angeles Times, since we're here, it's a good thing to talk about. They went through the 90s, totally mismanaged attempts to break down the barrier between the editorial side and the advertising side, which is sort of a secret wall of journalism. These embarrassing marketing schemes where they were coming up with these ideas and were splitting the profits with the advertisers. These trends have declined once the paper was sold to an out-of-town chain, the Tribune Company. Part of the story at the LA Times and at other newspapers has been the hollowing out of the staff. The number of reporters working at newspapers has dropped. In some cases, it's plummeted. So you're asking fewer people to put together a quality newspaper every day. This was ironically happening in the 90s when the business was thriving for the people at the top. You look at executive compensation in the newspaper industry, and it went through the roof in this period when the business was starting to, the fundamentals were starting to break up. So we're firing journalists, closing bureaus, shrinking the paper, and the guy at the top, usually the guy at the top making a ton of money. That was I think, the change that we saw in the 90s and then into this century as well. And it is that conflict between being profitable and serving the public that we have to wrestle with. It creates bad journalism in the short term. I think the quality of the papers declines. But you can still make money doing this. So the logic from the owners is not to change much because you're still making money, particularly in local news. Long term, people feel like they don't need the newspaper because the newspaper doesn't have much to offer them anymore. So that makes it bad for journalists, and then increasingly worse for journalists, and terrible for the public who rely on these news outlets for information. The silver lining, if there is one in all this, and this might be one of the things that we agree on coming at this from different perspectives, is that out of that failure, and I think there is a lot of failure in the old media, legacy media industry, comes something else. Digital revolution is still being, obviously it's in its infancy, we don't know what it's going to produce. But you see a media industry that in certain sectors is committing this seeming act of self-destruction, particularly in the newspaper business. And something else is probably, maybe, could take its place. The question is obviously going to be, what is that thing going to look like, and is it going to be any good?
Mr. Compaine?
I really disagree with this assumption, the question assumption that the media are more powerful, more consolidated than ever, and I've been following this for 35 years. In 1978, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, had a 2-day symposium on this topic of media consolidation. They assumed it was happening. They took all this testimony, they did all this research, and in the end, they found that there was much more smoke than fire, and it's been that way ever since. We keep hearing about books being written about more and more consolidation, and I've been saying this for 30 years. Where's the consolidation? We talk about Times Beer Company. When I did the first edition of Who Owns the Media, the most dominant media company in the country, based on having interest in newspapers, magazines, books, and more areas, being a major company in every one of those areas, was the Times Beer Company. They had an interest in 4 of the major 6 sectors of media. Today, for a variety of reasons, where are they? This isn't. We can argue, about why this happened. This is not the sign of a dominant media company that can't sell newspapers anymore. They lay off reporters because people aren't buying the newspaper anymore. And it's not because the newspaper has become worse, it's because we have so many sources of information. My question to the audience is here is, for anyone over 30, how many of you have fewer sources of information to go to today than you had 20 years ago? Is there anyone who says you have fewer sources to get stuff, to get mainstream stuff, unusual stuff? You can go to Al Jazeera, you can go to all sorts of foreign language things. You can go to the Guardian, you can go to the Hindu Times online. You can go to YouTube and see the Young Turks. I have some data. The Young Turks, a progressive video channel, claims they've had 650 million hits, more hits than any video site on the internet. And this is a group that would have never been in the old media. They're getting the message out, and you and I are accessing it. So I don't see this dominance. And I've said lots of data. Now, for those under 30, certainly like the students, you don't know the way it was before. When my daughter got on a plane my daughter's about 22, when she was about 7 or 8, she got on a plane with my wife, and I dropped her off at the airport. And about 2 hours later, I get a phone call from my daughter and say, Meg, you're still at the airport? What's wrong? She says, no, I'm calling from the airplane. And they used to have the phones on the sets. Again, if you're old enough, remember they had telephone sets in the seats. And my wife humored my daughter and spent $6 or something to have her call me. I said, Megan, isn't this amazing? And she said, what? Because to her, there have always been telephones on the plane. You guys who are students, you've always had this, in your conscious memory, you've always had this stuff. Us older folks remember when there were 3 networks. The 3 networks go, I usually have PowerPoint slides. This is as close as we can get to this. In 1970, we had 3 TV networks, and on average, they would get 56% of the primetime audience. By 2005, those networks, plus everything they owned, UPN and all the small networks of Discovery that they sort of bought interest in, all those things combined were only 53% of the audience. By 2008, the last year was down to 51%. And the 3 old networks went from 56% to 38% to 28% of the TV audience. Where's everyone else? They're at this other stuff. In the 1970s, the top-rated TV show, like Marcus Welby, would get a 30 share. Today, the top-rated TV show, American Idol, is a 12 share. Where is everyone? We're watching other stuff, we're reading other stuff. No one's dominating us. We're not all being force-fed stuff from News Corp or from Times Mirror and bankruptcy. I mean, where is this dominance that folks keep talking about? I don't see it.
Mr. Hart, would you like to respond?
The Clear Channel Company owned a few dozen radio stations in 1995. After 1996, they owned 700-something radio stations. It's not that the other radio stations disappeared, it's that one owner came and purchased many of these outlets. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a corporation having a dominant role in the media ecosystem. It's not that they vanquish all the competitors necessarily, it's that they gobble up shares of the pie. In the newspaper business, absolutely the trend has been toward one-paper towns, chain ownership. The Gannett chain and some of the smaller chains dominate the newspaper business. That's old media, but it does in fact exist, and they use cutthroat business tactics to vanquish their competitors. I think most people would agree that a town with more than one newspaper is a good town, because you can't go pick up 2 daily newspapers. Those towns are increasingly and extraordinarily rare in this country. So when we talk about what media consolidation looks like, it's often hard to understand in a digital age, because it is literally the world at your fingertips. But we're talking about companies that have managed to gather more power inside their respective sectors of the media. I think the more important problem is what the values are of these players that sit on public land in the form of television and radio spectrum. We go back to the local news. If you think your local news is mostly uninformed or uninformative, doesn't tell you much about your local community, doesn't represent the issues of your local community, why is that? Is it because everyone who works there is terrible? Is it because the journalists all took a vacation? It's because from up high, from the owner's perspective, a cheaper newscast is a better one. It's more profitable. Anyone can make money in local television. Everyone does. It's enormously profitable. And it's enormously profitable, especially when you cut corners in order to make it even more profitable. Newspapers, until the internet came and destroyed the classified advertising market, were the same. Everyone made money in the newspaper business. So the question for us, I think, has to be, if a local television station is getting our public airwaves to broadcast what it calls the news, this is part of the handshake agreement between the corporation and the public, and they're giving us very little of the news, but they're making a lot of money, that's a bad media system, and there's got to be some way to have a discussion about why that license holder has that enormous power in the community.
Mr. Compaine?
Like I said, we're talking about yesterday, the power of the local TV stations. There's so much stuff out there that, I don't watch the local news in Boston, and I stopped watching a long time ago, but I don't feel uninformed because there's so much other stuff. Brought up Clear Channel. Well, Clear Channel bought a lot of radio stations, but it didn't really change much about what was programmed. First of all, at their peak, they had maybe 11% of the radio stations in the country. This is a big dominant player, 11%. Secondly, when I was growing up, there weren't radio conglomerates. The FCC only restricted owners to 7 radio stations. But the major format on radio was top 40 music. And there were services that would send around sheets every week of what radio, what music was the hottest that week and what had a bullet and what you should play more of. This is just a service, but you go around the country and you hear pretty much the same stuff, not because they were owned by the same people, because culturally that's what's sold. The most homogeneous radio network is NPR, with 700 radio stations that I know of, all pretty much doing much of the same program. And there is not Clear Channel, no one else has to the same extent the number of programs that go on nationally the same way. So, and yet I don't hear anyone complaining about NPR. I mean, that's great stuff. But, so is the issue the number of radio stations, or is it what? And I think what the problem seems to be here is that it's, when you scratch the surface, it's the content that folks say it's not doing enough of the stuff we would like to see. It's not representing gays or Catholics or liberals or conservatives or socialists. It's not doing enough of what we want to see. And that seems to be much of the criticism that I hear about.
Thank you. Our next question. How much control do journalists have over the media that they produce, and do different owners put different pressures on journalists? We'll begin with Mr. Compaine.
Well, of course, different owners treat journalists differently, and that would not matter no matter who owns it. Someone has to own the media. If the labor union owned it, then presumably the labor union would, if you believe that corporate ownership biases media in a certain way, then if labor unions owned it, presumably they would bias it. If the employees owned it, then what are they going to get themselves 30% raises, and where's that money going to come from? If they're not going to have corporate advertising, where's the money going to come from? I got a grant. I worked with a nonprofit and got a grant from a very well-regarded, very high-level foundation. And they wanted me to do certain things. They said, we'll give you this $50,000, and we want you to bring in more people from South America and Africa into here. We want to see more women in your thing. Now, maybe good things, but they were attaching strings to it. And they were telling me to do things that I don't think our organization was right to do at that moment. So no matter who owns it, whether it's a foundation, a labor union, the employees, someone is going to have some say in it. That said, let me go back to one of my favorite quotes. I don't know if you know A.J. Lieberman, who was a writer, a press critic, one of the early press critics, who really gave the press a hard time, early newspapers, back in the 40s in particular. Lieberman was very, very critical of the ownership structure of the media, but this is what he wrote in the Wayward Pressman. He said, the profit system, while it ensures the dominant conservative coloration of our press, also guarantees there will always be a certain amount of dissidence. The American press has never been monolithic, like that of an authoritarian state. One reason, and remember this is the 1940s, not politically correct today, one reason is that there's always money to be made in journalism by standing up for the underdog. The underdog's wife buys girdles and baking powder and literary guild selections, and the advertiser has to reach her. To my mind, it's much better to have corporate owners, most of whom really don't care about the ideology. Yes, they want to make money, but I've never seen a newspaper go out of business for lack of content. A newspaper goes out of business when it doesn't have enough advertising, it doesn't have enough people buying it. So I would much rather have owners who say, in terms of their publishers, in terms of their editors, in terms of the folks who fund them, and this is how most of them work, and say, we don't care what you say, we want you to run a good newspaper as long as you make us some money. And we don't care if you endorse this candidate or that candidate, we don't care about this stuff. And that's the way most media companies work. In fact, the companies that I think have been, where the ownership has been most onerous is in mom and pop and individually owned newspapers. Walter Annenberg owned the Philadelphia Inquirer when I was growing up, and back in the 60s. And he prohibited the Inquirer from putting, a fellow who was running for governor, Bill Chap was running for governor in the 60s, he prohibited the papers from putting Chap's picture on the front page, and he was against Chap all along. A few years later, the Knight chain came in and bought the Enquirer, brought in Gene Roberts from the New York Times to run it. They started running Pulitzer Prize-winning stories. They built up that paper. The next time Bill Chap ran, he was treated like any good candidate, and he won. The Lobes that run the Manchester Union Leader were notorious for biasing their paper. Colonel McCormick that ran the Chicago Tribune, famous headline that Dewey beats Truman, was notorious for having his imprint on the paper. You don't hear that from Gannett, and you don't hear that from the chains today. Yes, they want to make some money, but that means they want to have a product that people will buy, and advertisers will subscribe to. You know, will help support, and that makes it cheaper for us to get this stuff. So I'm, you know, I sort of think that works pretty well. Mr. Hart?
I think if you want to answer the question about owners, you can ask working journalists. 20, 25 years ago, if you had a journalist, doesn't matter who the boss is. I think most, if not all of them, would say, no, I'm a journalist. I write my stories. It doesn't matter who's signing the checks. Very few reporters would say that now. And it's not because the boss is sitting on their shoulder telling them what to write or what not to write, but they've seen the effects of these kind of corporate-minded owners and what the effects have been on how the newsroom works. And I think that is the ideology of that kind of business class of ownership. It's not a political kind of bias that they're trying to push, but it has certain effects on the journalism that is produced. When you do surveys of journalists, asking them about pressure to do certain kinds of stories, to not do certain kinds of stories, you find that journalists talk about this as a real fact of life in their jobs. The Chicago Tribune columnist who wanted to write a piece about CEO pay, his editors thought that was fine until they decided he was going to write about the Tribune Company's CEO, and the piece was killed and he was out of there. The columnist at the Connecticut paper who wrote about an advertiser, well, he didn't write the right thing, he was fired. The self-promotion that goes on. You see TV newscasts that include stories about a sitcom actress who is on the network's primetime lineup. Every year, every Olympics year, the network that has the broadcast rights to the Olympics magically finds the Olympics a really newsworthy event that year. And when they lose the rights to broadcast the Olympics the next time around, they don't care about what happens in the Olympics because they are promoting something else within the company. It has nothing to do with journalistic values, it has everything to do with promoting their corporation. You see in local television, there's marketing arrangements with local hotels and businesses and hospitals to change the news, to in fact turn it into something that looks more like a commercial than a newscast. There are political pressures in this kind of system that we live in. In the run-up to the Iraq War, MSNBC fired its #1 host, Phil Donahue. Why would they fire their #1 host? It makes no sense as a capitalist, does it? Because he was against the Iraq War, and they knew that there was going to be war fever across the country, and they would have the one person on the air who was asking questions about this war. So they got rid of him. There are other kinds of pressures working journalists are under. If you're an access journalist, meaning you're working in Washington, D.C., primarily Washington, D.C., and you rely on having a relationship with government officials for information, for interviews, that has a certain kind of effect on whether or not you can be too adversarial. Some reporters can thrive in that system and can do great journalism, but it requires an editor and a publisher who are willing to back you up when the government says, we don't like what this person's doing. I met a young journalist a couple of months ago. His first job in journalism. He had a great, tough interview with the state senator, a U.S. senator from his home state, went back to his small radio outlet and said, I really had a great interview with Senator Rockefeller. And they said, well, we can't hear that, because we're going to need to go back to him and talk to him about the farm bill in a couple of weeks. We can't have our reporters having these kind of confrontations. These kinds of effects happen, and I think they happen and they're more pronounced in a corporate system. The decisions are sometimes made outside of the newsroom. So you don't know about the pressure on the publisher to do this or that favor for an advertiser. But sometimes the journalists do it themselves. Reporters can say, I meet with advertisers to talk to them. My publisher tells me to listen to what the advertisers think are important stories so that I will then go write those stories. It's a total corruption of journalistic ethics and traditional journalistic values, but it makes business sense. And that's where these two ideologies, I think, collide. These are the forces that shape, in some ways, the content in what we call mainstream media. And Fair's core critique of media performance has been that the press, over 25 years of doing this, the press is too deferential, too slow to challenge, to question policymakers, and they present a very narrow spectrum of debate in the national media. It makes perfect sense that that's the kind of media you have, given the structure of who owns it. It pays to think of journalism in that sense as the information that giant corporations will share with you so long as giant corporations who advertise in those news outlets will allow it. That's what the news is in a heavily incorporated system.
Would you like to respond?
What's to say? I've heard these stories. Someone says they got fired for this reason or that reason, or they couldn't write a story. It might be true, but I've never seen a pancake so thin it doesn't have two sides. That if you hear one person's side of the story, they say, "Oh, they wouldn't let me write this article." And if you probe further, maybe it's because they've already had 8 articles on this in the last month, or maybe it's because of 18 other reasons, or that the budget doesn't allow the travel expense that they need. And someone decides that the real reason is because the owner or the publisher or the editor didn't like point of view. We don't always know the whole story, and I find that anecdotal stories like that aren't useful for creating policy and setting an agenda. What I do see is that the big media are always publishing, writing, showing stuff that you would think would be against their own interests. If you look at the book list of HarperCollins, book publisher, owned by News Corp, they publish books by one of the recent books, Occupy Nation, a book very sympathetic to the Occupy movement, which I don't think is near and dear to the heart of the owners of News Corp. They published books by Todd Gittman, who was once the president of the Students for Democratic Society back in the 60s, a radical group. They publish his books. Why? Because they think they can sell the books and they can make some money. Time Warner has a comedy channel, Comedy Central. They have Jon Stewart and Colbert. If you watch them, these guys aren't sympathetic to, you might say, conservative values. Why? Because there's an audience for that. They know that they're advertising for that. They're going to make money. Hollywood, are you kidding? Big business Hollywood. And from It's a Wonderful Life, James Stewart, remember the evil banker, to Erin Brockovich, China Syndrome, recently the Lorax, and Dr. Seuss. If you look, the themes are constantly anti-big business, anti-capitalism, the evil business. Why do they do it? It makes a good story, it makes a good movie, and hopefully it makes the money. So, I think A.J. Leland was exactly right. The owners, by and large, aren't going to cut off their noses to spite their face. They're interested in making money, and if someone else owned the media, presumably they would have their own criteria. If you think the capitalists have their, set the agenda, then whoever else is going to have their agenda. You're just going to exchange one agenda for the other. You can decide which one you prefer. Okay.
Well, the anecdotes are actually surveys of journalists, so they're not anecdotes, they're survey research, normal for social science. I think the point that the labor union's channel would look different than the corporate channel or the National Organization for Women's channel would look different than the corporate-owned channel is exactly the point. The problem is that there aren't many opportunities to compete on that level that you have in the dominant media an overwhelmingly corporate system. So yeah, the labor channel would look very different wouldn't it be great if you had that channel? Wouldn't it be better in a more diverse media system? I think the answer is yes, but we don't have that. Corporate media are not, the idea that pursuing profit is ideology neutral, I think, is a false one. It produces content that I think does have a certain ideology. It's not necessarily conservative or liberal, but it is profit-seeking. When we're talking about journalism, which I think is different from entertainment, I think more things are allowed in the entertainment sphere of media than in journalism. But when we talk specifically about journalism and about news, I think the structure is a little bit different. You talk about the company that owns Comedy Central, CBS Viacom, now just Viacom. They will be happy to put that on the air because it's very profitable and makes money. But when 60 Minutes has a hot story on George W. Bush and Iraq war intelligence, and it's ready to air right before the 2004 elections, and they hold it, which has all actually happened, they hold it until after the elections because it would look particularly bad for George W. Bush. That is a fundamentally political decision that a corporate outlet is taking. And they're taking it because they're afraid to offend power, and they're afraid to offend the government. Those are things that happen, and I think I would argue that that is more important than the fact that they also own the company that owns The Daily Show.
Thank you. Our next question, what does polling data tell us about the representativeness and inclusiveness of major media outlets? Are they more or less aligned now with majority or minority views than has historically been the case? Begin with Mr. Hart.
I think it's important to imagine that you don't want a media system that's majoritarian. The New York Times had this huge piece on Walmart and bribery in Mexico last Sunday. There's not a huge public interest in that, but they understand that it's an important story and it's something worth reporting and investigating, and it does the public good. If it was a television newscast, it would be horrible ratings, but it does something important. That's what we want journalism to do. It's good if the media does not share the attention span of the public when it comes to an issue like climate change. It would be better if the media spent more time on it than the public wants. That would be a more informed public debate. Journalism, if it's doing its job, should offend and annoy and bother some people, sometimes a lot of people, sometimes often. So the question, I think, is not whether media reflect public opinion, but do they help mold it? Do they shape it? And I think you can talk about both things. We'll talk about the latter first. The Iraq War, for example, that was a crisis that was manufactured by political leadership in conjunction with the media to create this panic about non-existent threat to the United States. You see similar kind of scaremongering going on with Iran, though less so the media coverage, less so politically, so the media coverage is a little bit better. The Social Security quote-unquote crisis has been something that has been basically manufactured by a certain group in Washington, ideologically speaking, and has been trumpeted in the media for the better part of the last 20 years. Panic over the federal budget deficit, doing something and cutting spending, is often portrayed as a public concern. The public, when you ask them, are more concerned about other things. But if they keep hearing about the budget crisis, then they'll say they're more concerned about this budget crisis. I saw last weekend a couple of journalists talking about their obsessive coverage of this scandal with the Colombian prostitutes of the Secret Service. They were covering that, they said, because the public really wanted them to, and that the public was losing faith in its institutions. And so we are playing to that public sentiment by covering this prostitution scandal. It's a bizarre argument to make, but it's when journalists are doing something they know journalistically doesn't make a lot of sense, but they want to make it sound like they're playing to a high-minded public interest. So those are cases where the media, I think, help shape public opinion. Now, if you're talking about reflecting public opinion, that's a different set of questions. And I think when you talk about important policy debates, what we have found in studying media content is that the media often do a very bad job of conveying popular ideas. When you poll people about extending Medicare for everyone, single-payer healthcare system. It's very popular if you ask the public. It basically doesn't exist in the political debate over our healthcare system. If you ask people about quote-unquote free trade deals like NAFTA, the public is very skeptical. The media coverage is generally supportive. And this is what happens when you study media coverage and understand the trends. These popular positions are turned into minority or fringe positions. The way FAIR has studied this over the years is you just look at who gets a chance to speak. We call them source studies. You watch the newscasts, you read the papers, who's quoted. And by looking at who's quoted, you can get a sense of who the media think are important. And it's been remarkably consistent over a range of issues over 20 some odd years. The media prefer a certain class of experts, people in government, close to government, former government. These are the dominant experts in the media system. Many more spokespeople for corporations than for labor unions, and so on and so forth. Public interest voices are a tiny part of that public debate. So when you're talking about public opinion, I think it's important to figure out which side of that question you're trying to address. It's funny because conservatives, if you talk to conservatives about what's wrong with the media, they will look at the very same media system and say, oh, the problem is that very liberals and that conservatives never get to speak up in the media. And there's no data that supports that idea. What it is a tactic, a political tactic. It's called working the refs. If you've ever watched sports, a coach complains to the referee about a call, not necessarily because it was a bad call, but because you want to implant the idea in the referee's mind that they owe you one. And I think conservatives have been very good at looking at a media system that is not hostile to their point of view and demanding and declaring that it is, in the hopes that the media change the way they cover certain issues to be more favorable to their side. So I think the big question is not whether the media reflects sort of the majority opinion of the country, but whether it provides diversity. And that's, I think, the most important test for what kind of media system we have.
Mr. Compaine?
It's a very legitimate question about whether or not the media should be leaders or followers. And of course the answer is both. You can always tell pioneers as to the ones who get, one person who gets shot at first. And the media have to do two things. Yes, they have to sometimes be out in front and tell us things that we don't want to know about. But if that's all they do, then they're setting the agenda, and they're not listening to what us, the consumers, want to consume. And I think that they've got to do both those things. Increasingly, though, this notion of the major media outlets are becoming far less important. The media increasingly are taking their hint from what's trending on Twitter, for example. What are people talking about on Twitter? And that's what they're concentrating on. And so they're listening sort of to us and what we're concerned about. And if we're concerned about single-payer system, presumably we'll have hashtag single-payer, and that will start trending. We're not doing that. I mean, there may be a little chicken and egg problem. Some years ago, an academic named Herbert Gans, a sociologist, did a book called Deciding What's News. And he did a very rather intensive study. Said, how come the major news outlets, this is back in the 70s, ABC and NBC and Time Magazine, seem to have the same stories, on the headlines, and seem to focus on a lot of the same stuff. And his conclusion was it wasn't because someone was telling them what to do, but journalists tend to become acculturated in the notion of what makes a good story, what's a good narrative, what's important, what they think people should see. And no matter what organization they work for, they would tend to come up with sort of similar decision making. So it's not sort of a conspiracy when 60 Minutes held off putting on this, I don't remember that situation, but held off the programming. Again, it's a pancake. Some of the journalists there said, if we air this now, we can be accused of trying to tilt the election against Bush, that it might seem to be unfair to be bringing this up just before the election. so let's hold it. You can also interpret it, you know, more conspiratorially, that they wanted to help Bush. But, you know, these folks try to make, I think, decent decisions. There is one of the best studies I saw in this area of what drives media slant. And this was a study done, the most thorough content analysis study I've ever seen in my life. They used computer-generated terms and went through the congressional record to find terms that conservatives and liberals used in Congress, and then they ran that through the entire database of newspapers that covered 80% of the population. And they found that the most important variable, and this isn't correlation, this is direction. They found the most important variable in determining the tone, the slant of a newspaper in a particular town, city, was the essentially the political coloration of that city. That is, red-colored cities, more conservative cities, tended to have slightly more conservative uses of terms, like instead of talking about estate tax, they might talk about the death tax, which is what conservatives were using. In liberal-leaning cities tended to have newspapers that were a little more reflective of the liberal side. They said that in examining ownership, the political coloration of the population, and a number of other variables, they found the largest factor for determining the slant of local newspapers was in the political coloration of the readers, the subscribers. And the owners, they said, were a far less factor. Overall, I think that, I've said this before, the major media outlets today are less important than ever. We have to stop talking about that as though it's the only rooster in the barnyard. It may have been, it ain't that way anymore. The media today is like the old magazine rack. If you can pick up the National Review, the Nation, the Progressive, you can pick up whatever you want, and it's there for us, guys. It's there for us, and let's stop worrying about sort of what used to be.
Would you like to respond?
I think there's no doubt that there's plenty of opportunity to access different types of information. The advantages that the incumbents have, I think, are enormous. If they weren't, there's no television network right now that's happy to give up its broadcast license. That's old media, it doesn't matter, nobody cares about it, nobody watches it. But funny, none of them will just give these things up. In fact, they'll go to Washington to lobby to try to figure out ways to expand their media empires and make them even bigger. So if these companies just don't know what the business model is, then that's one thing. I suspect they know exactly what they're doing, and they understand that having this old media foothold is very important and very profitable. So I know there's a divide between old media and new media and how we think about these things, but the old media giants are still very powerful and still understand that their status affords a certain kind of power. The nightly newscasts have much smaller audiences than they did 20 years ago, but they still have sizable audiences. They still have millions of viewers. The lowest rated nightly newscast is still watched by far more people than the highest rated cable news broadcast. I don't know why that is in a universe where people have so many different options, but it remains the case that these companies still have enormous power and enormous audiences in a very fragmented media environment. And as for public opinion, I think the important thing to ask yourself is, given that the media have that kind of power, they do have the power to set a certain type of agenda. One of the exciting things about new media is that people can challenge that, and people can push the media to care about stories, whether it's only 2012, a viral video that 2 weeks before it broke, nobody was even familiar with the story, but then all of the broadcast networks are doing segments about this. So there are these new tools for people to amplify things that I think would be happening way out of the margins if it weren't for the internet.
And Mr. Compaine?
Well, I think ended on the note that I agree with it, that, in fact, FAIR sort of brags about the fact lots of ways of getting the message out. The group Free Press, I don't know if you're familiar with Free Press. If you're interested in media, you may have seen them. They have a conference each year, a media reform conference. This is a group that also has similar complaints about the mainstream media not being available to them, and yet after their conferences, they talk about how they got so much coverage on this network, this TV station. They were on PBS. They had 18,000 blogs. I mean, essentially, they're saying we're precluded from getting access to the public, and by the way, you got access to them 387 different ways. Democracy Now, I think a rather left-wing group has a TV station that every time I turn on my cable station system, there's a program with Amy Goodman on there. And they're always on the radio. They've got the podcast. So I just don't see how we can complain about the powerful media. The evening newscasts may get more than any other single podcast, video thing, but in aggregate, all these other things make the old network stuff a very small minority. So it's still a small piece in aggregate compared to everything else that's out there.
Thank you. Our final question for the night is as follows. With the growing emphasis on blogging and social media, where do you see the future of our access to information heading? We will begin with Mr. Compaine.
Well, yeah, it's a good way to end, because I've mentioned Twitter, I've mentioned how many of us are finding out stuff from Facebook. And on the one hand, there's not hard-hitting journalism on Twitter. There's not hard-hitting journalism on a lot of blogs. But in aggregate, they are exposing WikiLeaks, having a huge impact that couldn't have happened in the past. We've had, it actually goes back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the Shah controlled all the media in Iran. He controlled it all. But he had put in a modern direct dial telephone system in Iran, trying to modernize Iran, that allowed the Ayatollah and his minions to call into the country with their instructions without having to go through the old Soviet style, with an operator that could listen in on that stuff. They used audio cassettes to get the sermons that they wanted to spread in Iran back then. They used the Xerox machines with the printing press at the time. The Shah controlled the printing presses, but they could use xerography. We've seen this now with the Arab Spring. The examples of the new media providing, if not hard-hitting journalism, certainly with informing us that things are going on, that things we need to know about, that we can start finding out about, with guys with little cheap cell phones in Syria taking videos of Assad's activities and posting that on YouTube. I mean, come on. And then, of course, the major media can pick up on that and expand on it, send out the correspondence. But the fact that all this stuff can get out there is tremendous. The one thing that I think is important that perhaps we haven't, well, let me just go, I mentioned China before. China is having so much trouble with the Great Firewall. They have gone to huge expense and great efforts to keep things the way they want them to. And even then, stuff keeps getting out on their version of Twitter. They can take it down after a few days, but they can't keep the genie in the bottle. It just ain't going to happen. The one thing that I think that we really need more of, something I call source literacy. We used to have oral literacy, to be able to compose and recite orally. Then alphabets came along. Literacy became to read and write. Today, if there's any long-term issue that I see, it's for folks to be able to understand what the source of this stuff they're seeing on the internet is. We've seen that if you don't go to Snopes.com, all these urban myths get spread around, and these email things that tell you that people are being abducted and this and that. They go to Snopes and you find out that it's an urban myth. I think that what we might be missing, if anything, is curated information. The fact that fewer and fewer of us are getting our news from nightly news, from the New York Times, from the LA Times. And more of us are getting it from sources where we really can't, we don't know what the imprimatur is. We don't know who's really providing this. And I think we really have to have our antenna up, and especially I'm talking to the students here, to question, where did this come from? What's the source? Is it from left wing, right wing? Is it from, someone just made it up, someone was an axe to grind, some advocacy group? Is it from, who knows where? But to have some sense of where this stuff comes from, and then make your judgments and maybe look further for it. So I think that social media and the way things are going have a tremendous impact. Huffington Post just got a Pulitzer Prize, doing real stuff. Yahoo News sent this guy Kevin Seitz out to go around the world for a year with his little video cam and stuff. Was sending back reports from all over the world about hotspots, political hotspots. Did you see that? It was tremendous stuff. I'm super optimistic, except when I worry a little bit about understanding where the stuff is coming from.
Thank you. Mr. Hart.
This is probably the area where we agree the most. It is sometimes feel like an antiquated discussion about media power in this era of seemingly unlimited choices. It's worth pointing out that a sizable chunk of the population is not blogging and tweeting and Facebooking. They're not even checking into that stream of information, so we always have to be cautious about what part of us we're talking about. Access, if you are part of that digital world, access to information has probably never been greater. We used to, in prehistoric days, as media critics, if you read something in the New York Times and it was a much different take than the Washington Post, you couldn't send out an email with a link and people could read them and understand what you were talking about. We possessed a paper copy of the Washington Post and a paper copy of the New York Times, and we could explain to people how they were different if they wanted to hear that. But you couldn't show someone the same way that you can now. So the digital revolution, if you want to call it that, has been a boon to independent media, has been a boon to media critics as well. Both in their own ways challenge the old way of doing things, and they challenge big media. The big question is whether or not this new platform or these new platforms can sustain investigative reporting, open foreign bureaus and places where important things are happening that we need to know about. Can it even sustain good local journalism? And unfortunately, the answer so far is not really. We haven't seen enough good examples of this. Yahoo had a very ambitious plan to hire a lot of journalists. They've mostly been slashing jobs in the last couple of years. The Huffington Post mixes some very good reporting. They hired a lot of investigative reporters and veterans from the newspaper business. That site is that and a bunch of stuff that she would be embarrassed to be looking at if someone knew what you were doing on the internet. So it is both of those worlds. The old media still have some inherent advantages, and I would argue some massive ones. A website is not a TV network. It never will be, as long as there continues to be television. Cable TV, the structure of cable TV gives enormous advantages to the incumbent players, either the people who make the content or the people who distribute it. The way cable television works is if you have a channel and you can make an agreement to the cable company to put your channel on the lineup, they will pay you and pass the costs on to consumers. So if you have cable television and you don't want to watch ESPN or Fox News Channel or MSNBC, tough, you pay for it. And in the case of ESPN, you pay a lot for it. So the big media companies still have an enormous way of extracting money from you that I think the digital universe still hasn't figured out. No one can make your modem pay the Huffington Post for being there. Now, the media giants, according to I think some analysts, have been too big, too slow to react to all of these technological changes, and they're basically just on their heels right now as the digital revolution presents all of these challenges to their business models. They were mismanaged, the product became worse, nobody's picking up the paper because there's not much in it, and what you could read in the paper you can get online now. So all of those things I think are true. And as a critic, and sometimes a very harsh critic of the media system, part of me looks at that and says, you know, if they want to die via self-inflicted wound, that's their problem, and something else will come along, and hopefully that something else will be better. So that's, I think, where we're at. If you believe in the mission of sort of high-minded, civic-oriented, public interest journalism, and you believe that media should provide that, not because the government forces them, but because it's important to democracy, then the question is, how does the internet provide that kind of thing? And I think that's the great unresolved problem of our current media environment.
Mr. Compaine, final thoughts?
So he gets the last word. Clearly we're developing, we need some new models as the old models evolve, as the newspapers are going downhill, not because they're doing a worse job, it's cause and effect. Are they doing a worse job and therefore they're not getting subscribers, or because subscribers and readers are leaving them, they don't have the resources to do the job they used to do? I think it's the latter. I think the fallout of readers is because we can get our news so many other places. Advertisers have so many other ways of reaching their customers. John Wanamaker, the merchant, once said back in the 19th century, half my advertising dollars are wasted, I just don't know which half. So they would have to advertise in the newspaper and try to reach everyone. Today, they can be much more specific, and they don't have to just put big ads in the newspaper. You can use Craigslist instead of classified ads. So the models that funded a lot of this research are gone, and we're still having to find our ways to what the new models are. But I think that there's stuff out there. I mean, the fact that there are citizen journalists, and I don't mean professional, but the fact that we do develop a lot of this stuff on our own. The WikiLeaks is an example. A lot of information now comes from a whistleblower who used to make it before you would never have heard about him or her. You would have to have a newspaper, have a team of investigators to pick which story to look at. Now this stuff gets out there, and actually the stuff can be identified. What's going on out there? And it might be that fewer professional journalists are needed to be able to follow up on those stories, because a lot of the legwork has already been done. A lot of the sources have already been found and are out there for us. So and we have new forms like Global Post and other ProPublica. We're still trying to figure out which of these things are going to work and how they're going to work. So you know, a lot of work has to be done, but I just think that there's so much out there. I've been doing work on media entrepreneurship. I just had an article published in the journal. I wouldn't recommend you read because it's a scholarly journal. And I can give you the headline, and that is that there's a huge bottom-up feeling from entrepreneurs who want to go into the media. And this is from 30 interviews with folks like Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia, and a lot of other folks, Michael Kicking-Bear, who does an Indian, Native American radio show. These folks are very optimistic about the opportunities. They don't see the big companies as being as providing a barrier, because they think the big companies are too slow and just don't get it. And they see the opportunities. They don't see any barriers in the way financially, because today with a MacBook you can do anything that used to take $100,000 to do. So I'm very positive on this. You might think that.
Mr. Hart, your final words.
Sometimes I'm positive about it too. I think the main lesson that I draw from the change that's going on is that we entered a period of our media history where the decisions were made via government policy and elsewhere that big profit-seeking corporations could provide the news, and in fact should provide the news. And I think that was the dominant model, and it's proven to not be a very good way to deliver journalism. It's been a very good way to deliver media content of different types, but has it been good for journalism and for an informed democracy? I think the answer is unambiguously no, it's not been. So in the sense that new models might provide different kinds of journalism and more diverse types of journalism, then I think we could be in a good phase. But broadly speaking, the old media, I think, did the public a great, just and continue to do the public a great disservice. We also should bear in mind that some of the things that feel new have precursors in the old media. WikiLeaks is new and it releases things via the internet. Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers standing at a machine and copying them for days and days. I would argue Ellsberg's old media system, or old media reality, was more politically explosive than it came out in the old media environment. But WikiLeaks has had more impact when it's partnered with old media to publish. The WikiLeaks revelations that were published simultaneously by the New York Times and by other newspapers had far more impact than when WikiLeaks releases things on their own. So there is this interesting kind of interplay, and the fact that people at WikiLeaks tend to dislike people at the New York Times at this point. So you do have, I think, a situation where we are in this moment where we're either at the beginning of something new and exciting, or we're at the very beginning of it. And that's the hard part, I think, to figure out.
Thank you. Please join me once again. We now have time for you to ask questions of our speakers. Please line up at the center if you wish to ask a question.
Culturally speaking, I don't think there's a lot of dissident art that reaches that mass audience. But the audiences are generally more fragmented, so it's hard to compare eras. I never really thought about this. I don't want to sound like a old person, but I talked to somebody who was 20-something recently, and it was a point of view I never really considered, but he was saying that he has grown up, basically his entire conscious life has been in the shadow of September 11th. And so his understanding of patriotism and the country and permissible expression and then those kinds of issues is a lot different than mine, even. We're not a huge gap in age. So I think there are people who feel like much of their formative years were spent in a culture that was a little tighter and a little less expressive. In terms of how the American media compare to international media, it's really difficult to make generalizations when you can't travel and speak the languages. I think one of the things that inspired the founding of my organization was our director traveling across Europe and seeing in major cities 5, 10 papers in every city, all with definable political points of view. And to him, it felt like a much more robust, interesting political dialogue that was going on as opposed to the United States, where you have a chain paper in every town. This was the mid-'80s. And I think there is, and there has been that sense, public broadcasting is very different in other countries than it is here. At the same time, you know, we're talking about countries that have vibrant political discussions, but broadly speaking, 3 or 4 television channels. So the number of options available to you doesn't compare to the United States. And then finally, the sort of imperialist media, kind of, as you're saying, they're bombarded with American media.
A very small niche group of American media.
Yeah, the things that export well, and in some cases, China, places where the censors will allow certain things. You know, I've spoken for years to foreign journalists who come to the United States, and we're coming based on the assumption that Fox News was a parody because they couldn't believe that was a real thing. And she said, no, it's the dominant cable channel, news channel. Oh, because we saw clips and we thought, well, this is good. You know, they're doing, I guess this is like Jon Stewart. No, this is serious. And so I think people's exposure to other media systems can be a source of great confusion because of what the impression they get from the United States is often very strange. We're bathing in it all the time, so you have to go somewhere else sometimes to.
And I think we also have access to a lot. We know what media, you know, we can look up Al Jazeera, we know many more sources than other people do who just turn on the TV in a country that might only have 3 or 4 television stations. And so I think when we talk about the diversity of media nowadays, we have to think about the number of eyeballs that's going to each particular station and the ownership of that station. But most of my questions are geared towards you, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm just going to consider that, you know, I think that we can't compare our situation to those of the rest of the world. Because first, they used to have 10 newspapers, but they were all national newspapers. We had far more newspapers, but they were very local. So if you lived in parts of France and Nice, you might not have gotten any part of the newspapers you had in Paris. So they had a lot of papers, but different kind of coverage. Broadcasting was a couple channels, but it was public service broadcasting and had far lower audiences.
What country are you speaking about?
What's that?
What country are you speaking about?
I was Europe in general. I mean, every local newspapers are unheard of in most of Europe. The countries are pretty small geographically. The UK is one of the few countries that actually have local daily newspapers. Very few, most of the media in European countries tend to be national media. You know, pretty small little things elsewhere. What gets exported, you know, that goes back to the days of Dallas and stuff. But we don't control what other places decide to buy. We offer this stuff, and the folks there decide which of our stuff they think will be most popular for their audiences. We don't push it on them.
Unfortunately, we're running low on time, so continue this discussion.
Sorry, we actually don't want to go through. There's a lot that we have, so if we just put the conversation out with a lot of and I encourage everyone to continue talking and asking questions of our teachers. So thank you very much. But please do continue the conversation.
The microphones.
But yeah, we'll just conclude the formal part of the event and you can ask your question after this.